news, but today's topic is, of course, something that is so pertinent in the whole country and our community as well. So we have Harlan to introduce tonight's guest speaker. So I'll let Harlan take it from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. It is a pleasure to come out and see you, even though I see the snow coming, and I'm ready for summer, as I said to you. I'm ready for the summer already. I'm not very kind of getting a little weak in my old age, I guess. But thank you for coming out tonight. Yeah, it's a nice job for me tonight because they just said, could you introduce Larry? That means I don't have to know anything, you know? That's pretty good, because usually we get the questions. But on the serious side, this is interesting. If you haven't dug into some of the things on the Electoral College, you know, my level of expertise is when I ran the last time, I won by 35 votes after 2 or 3 weeks of counting provisionals, absentee ballots. Some people call me landslide Harlan, but I don't know if I like that too well. But bottom line is I did see a lot of the process, you know, watching how careful people do things. And I think about Larry, and I introduced Larry here as we go. You know, 36 years ago, Larry Spahr came into our election office, and we were talking about what have we seen from 36 years till now. And what we were doing about the 81, what was 81?
Yes, sir.
About 1981 time frame was we had paper ballots, and you went to the election and you did your paper ballot, and then a whole lot of people sat down and manually went through paper ballots and counted. Punch cards were coming in at the time. And, you know, we all know about the hanging chads and the things that went on with that, but you know, it's just look where we've come with the machines and things that we have. And you talk about where we're at today with the machines, the verifying that goes on at the election polls, you know, at the offices, on the machines. And, you know, bottom line is I was very happy because of my short experience, and I don't hopefully do that too many more times, but I was very happy that the things were really straightforward, no matter who won. It was basically something that I had trust in, seeing the inside, being on the outside with the political side. So basically, we've come a long way, as we know, in technology. By the way, I talked to some of the guys, young fellas here. So glad to see you here tonight. You know, we need our youth. We need more involvement from our young generation. And so with that, you know, Larry Spahr has been with us 36 years. He's been our director of our elections office, and he's here tonight to talk to you about some of the things that happen in election time frames, and we'll let him take off. And like I would think, Larry, we wanted to have an open discussion. If you have questions, you know, I think we're all informal. Just do your thing, and we'll see where we go. I'm here because I want to learn myself. There's a lot of things I really didn't know about. So with no more talking from Harlan, Larry, you want to take over and do your thing. I guess I had more responsibility than I thought I did. I can do this, by the way. If anyone else needs one.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Commissioner, for the introduction. And you all know why we're here this evening, right? We're going to talk about the Electoral College. And my first exposure in depth to the Electoral College was about 50 years ago when I was in school, undergraduate school and graduate school. And some of the texts that I brought with me tonight, I've had since those years. And I use them for reference from time to time at the elections office this very day. Now, how many of you are familiar with how the Electoral College works? Really an in-depth knowledge. In-depth knowledge, and this is usually the level of discussion, questions we get asked at the elections office, either by visitations or through telephone calls. Folks will ask prior to a presidential primary or general, Larry, what's the Electoral College? How does it work? what's it all about. And I'm sure you all are aware, especially currently, since we just went through a presidential election, which isn't done yet, by the way, about the matter of presidential electors versus popular vote. Now, we're going to have a municipal primary next year where your council people, township supervisors, auditors, school directors, magistrates will all appear on the ballot, and some state judges, by the way, at the Supreme Court, the Superior Court, the Commonwealth Court. And how are these folks elected? How is it determined whether or not they are elected? By popular vote, right? But our presidents are not selected by popular vote. And I'll get into the reasons why. Now, let me qualify what I just said. And again, I'll explain this aspect to you. Indirectly, the general electorate is involved, but the actual election of a presidential candidate is determined by the presidential electors. Now, if you folks will take a look at your ballots, and I provided these purposely for this evening, there's a primary ballot and a general ballot, the format of which we used in Washington County for this past presidential election. And I want you to look in the top left corner, or at the top of the ballot, depending upon the primary or general ballot, for the office of president, I'll call it. I get questions from the general electorate again about the language that's on those ballots. Do you see where it says on the general ballot, presidential elector? On your general election ballot, look at your title. It says presidential elector. Vote for the candidates of one party, and it lists the candidates nominated for the office of president. But those presidential electors, and that language is there legally and specifically, and it's a direct tie-in to the Electoral College. We do not direct or elect a president or presidential candidates and their vice presidents, by the way. Popularly, they're elected by presidential electors. And I'll explain that to you. That language on those ballots and the difference in the language between the primary and the general is there specifically and legally. Your primary ballots will list your presidential candidates who qualified by petition to have their names placed on primary ballots, but that's only a straw poll. That primary election has no meaning. For vote tabulation for election, it's just a way to gauge the sentiment of the electorate at the primary. That's why you have a difference in language. The real nuts and bolts for selecting a presidential candidate and a vice presidential running mate occurs at the general election. The popular vote, as I said, and I'll get into it further, has some meaning, but it's not really significant. And what's the reason for this? How many of you are familiar with what we call the Federalist Papers? Have you ever heard of them? Yes. Do you know about them? John Jay, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton. They think. They think. And the reason for that is all these, what we know as Federalist Papers, were letters written by some of the founding fathers, given to the New York newspapers in 1788, 1789, when the United States Constitution was being written and considered for adoption. It was, they think, these three gentlemen, under a pseudonym called Plubius, who wrote these letters, as I said, to the New York newspapers at the time, to try to persuade, argue, why this Constitution should be adopted in the manner in which it was being contemplated. The Federalist paper, number 68, they were each numbered, and I think there was a total of about 85 written over that period. Federalist paper number 68, it is believed was written by Alexander Hamilton. And as I was telling the commissioner and a couple of the other folks that we were talking earlier, when you look at some insight about what happened at that time, how this Constitution was developed, and from time to time we'll hear folks expressing opinions, what genius these men had, what foresight they had, what knowledge they had about human nature. Was that done by divine intervention? Who knows? But once I explain to you folks tonight more topics about how the Electoral College developed, you know, think about these kinds of things. Did it happen by accident? There were these brilliant men who understood the place of the word power in government and why they divided that power among the various agencies, branches, because they didn't trust, because of their prior experience with King George III and the British government at the time, while they were all colonists, and certain philosophers like John Locke, upon whose philosophy about power and government they relied. It wasn't by accident that this all occurred. Also, what I want to do tonight is we'll talk about the electors themselves, where they come from, who are they, what are their qualifications. Now, if you look on your ballot, your general ballot, we're going to vote for presidential electors. Do you see any electors' names on that ballot? You'll see the presidential candidates. You will not see any electors' names on that ballot. So we'll talk about that, as I said, where these electors come from, who they are, what their qualifications are, and also I'll discuss some of the past presidential elections that occurred in the United States and how the Electoral College was involved. And there were some very significant elections. You know, I was telling Mr. Schober at the election of 2000, when a recount was occurring in Florida, you know, some of us up in the office found some of the statements extremely humorous that some of these multi-million-dollar telecasters located in New York City were making. Some of them made statements that told me they didn't know what in the world they were talking about. And they were misleading the American public. I had an occasion, I was invited by KDKA to do a taping with John Craig, who was a chief editor at that time, I believe, of the Post-Gazette, and he had that Sunday program. Well, all this was going on in November 2000. They called me up to the office one day and they said, Larry, since you guys use the punch card, would you mind coming down and on Friday, and I believe it was, might have been Veterans Day, to tape a program with us. Well, there was he and I and a constitutional law professor from the University of Pittsburgh. Well, before we had begun to tape, we three were discussing among ourselves what was going on in Florida. And the professor made a statement. And I said to the professor, my God, professor, don't say that while we're taping, where it's going to be broadcast all throughout the Pittsburgh area. And Mr. Craig started to laugh. He was on my immediate right. And John said, well, Larry, why did you say that? What's the problem? And the professor, who was sitting in a chair on my left, just looked up at me. And I explained to him. I said, that is not election law. I said, we're getting enough misinformation being broadcast. So we're going to look at some very significant prior historical elections that occurred in this country that had significant consequences for almost 100 years out, where governmental policy was affected by those decisions made almost a century prior. All right, the presidential electors in the Electoral College. Let's characterize the Electoral College as one professor, and I never forgot this. Don't ask me why, but I didn't. Characterize the Electoral College as democracy with brakes on. And he said it almost 50 years ago. Well, as I was reviewing some of my text and some of my notes the other day, I began to wonder about him. And I went on the internet, and I found his obituary, where he passed away in March of 2015 at 83 years old. He was about 35 when I had him. One of the most outstanding teachers I ever had in my life. And when I told you, I never forgot him. And I would ask other professors whom I knew, if they came in the office, about what he was doing, if anybody knew what happened to him. He was the gentleman, PhD, law degree, Marine veteran at 16 years old. He went in the Korean War when he lied about his age. Born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee. He was living at Rice's Landing when he passed away, but his body was returned for interment to his hometown in Nashville. I could still see him. I thought about him and what he did, some of the classroom work that we were doing after I read his obituary, like it was yesterday. But democracy with brakes on. That Electoral College added a level of protection. We might think of it in the lexicon of computer terminology today, the firewalls. That's exactly what the Electoral College is. It's a firewall. It divides, it separates. As Alexander Hamilton said, the office of President, Chief Executive Officer of the United States under the proposed Constitution, was too important of a position to leave to the masses in final decision. Mob rule. They didn't want that. Popular vote. As Jim and I were talking about, we saw it in this election where Hillary Clinton received the majority of her popular vote between the states of California and New York. The founding fathers said, no, no. We're going to require by this Electoral College these presidential candidates to travel among the states, not 1, 2, or 3, or a small number of large states with huge populations were going to determine ultimately who the candidates were that were elected president. That decision was going to be made through the Electoral College arrangement among all the states. Now, I know we hear arguments today, I've heard arguments in every presidential, should the Electoral College be eliminated? Should we go to straight popular vote, like all the other offices? Well, you folks can make up your own minds and think about that a little bit. But that was one of the reasons, or several reasons, why that Electoral College was adopted. We're not going to leave it up to totally a popular vote. We're going to try to control so that we have an electorate, meaning the electors, who are going to elect people with virtue, with ability to occupy that office. And how so very, very important a concept that was, given today, the power that our President of the United States has, and how that power has grown and expanded since the end of World War II. There are various professors who've studied just that concept, the growth of presidential power since the end of World War II. And when I said earlier, I don't imagine those founding fathers thought consciously about what may happen 200, 250 years out with that office of president. But boy, did they hit the nail on the head. Where do these folks come from? And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any questions, stop me, and I'll try to respond if I have the knowledge. How are these presidential electors selected? In this, what I'm going to talk about, their selections, how they're chosen, is in today's world different from what it was when the Constitution first took effect in 1800, and with the election of George Washington as the first president of the United States under the Constitution in 1789 through and taking office in 1790 through 1788. If you would read how presidential candidates were selected, and you think we have a hodgepodge today, and it appears to be mass confusion, read some of the accounts of that time, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, of how presidential elections were conducted. Presidential elections and ballots were cast sometime from September through January the following year. There was no one day where everybody congregated on so-called election day in uniform, cast ballots. How the presidents and vice presidents were arranged on the ballot itself. The section, Article 2 of our United States Constitution, Section 2, is where you're going to find the framework for the Electoral College and how the presidents are elected. They have to have a majority vote. A majority vote of the total presidential electors. That's where we get to 270 from in today's world. The number of electors equals the total number, and I'll take it down to state level. For example, Pennsylvania, we have 18 representatives in Congress. That's based on population, right? So this is what I was saying earlier, indirectly, the population, the general electorate gets involved here. We have 2 U.S. senators per state for a total of 20, 18 and 2. Under the Constitution, Pennsylvania is entitled to 20 presidential electors, and so on down the line for each state. That's how the number of presidential electors is determined at each state level. What are their qualifications? Very limited, very limited. Again, the U.S. Constitution will outline and tell us who cannot serve. Everybody else is fair game. If you're a federal official, if you're a federal employee, if you're a federal worker, but that's never been contested, by the way, and I want to tell you about some other points here that have never been contested in court where the electors are concerned. Everybody else is fair game. At the end of your political party conventions and your presidential years, the candidates nominated by the parties will caucus, and along with party officials and functionaries, they'll say, okay, Pennsylvania, you're entitled to 20 electors. Who are those electors going to be in Pennsylvania? Joe Blow, Sally Smith, they're usually party functionaries. People who have worked extensively and have a basis, a proven basis for being a good party worker. And hopefully they'll have the background necessary to make a good, honest judgment when they're voting for the presidential candidates. Now here's another kicker for you. And we're hearing this lately. I was just reading some information about this on the internet the other day, as I try to keep abreast of it. What's happening with some of these presidential electors? Florida, Michigan, Texas. There was a gentleman, a presidential elector from Texas on Fox News this morning. I read about him the other day. A faithless elector. Now, who are these faithless electors? These are the electors who may change their mind about who they're going to vote for in preparation for their caucus. On December the 19th, only a week or so out, week and a half out, all these electors will get together at their state capitals under supervision of the chief election officer of the state and within certain boundaries set by the Constitution and federal law. But most of these boundaries, there's a lot of authority left to the states as to how these things could be organized. It's just not all the federal government. Well, one of these electors in Texas said, look, he was selected Donald Trump. Donald Trump carried the state of Texas. And usually that's what the law says at the state level. The candidates carrying the popular vote in the state will have their electors recognized. So if Hillary Clinton, in some of the states that she won, those electors that she had selected and the party functionaries would caucus to cast their ballots. But are these people required by law to follow through with their pledge that, yes, I pledge to vote for Hillary Clinton, yes, I pledge to vote for Donald Trump? Are they required by law to carry through with that pledge? No. Even though state laws exist that say that these folks, once they pledge, if their candidates carry majority vote in that state, then they're duty bound to vote for that candidate. That's not entirely true. They can change their minds, as we're seeing currently. Now, what sanctions, what penalties can be placed against them if they become a faithless elector? In other words, they do a 180-degree turn and vote for another candidate. There's never been a presidential elector, although there haven't been many throughout American history. It has occurred. There's never been a case in the Supreme Court to adjudicate that issue. Can they or can't they be penalized for changing their mind and going with another candidate other than the one they pledged to support? That has yet to be contested in the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's going to be interesting to see what these folks will do. I listened to some of the presidential electors, some from Florida, some from Michigan, who were saying just the other night they're getting thousands of emails trying to convince them to change their vote, even to the point where they're being physically threatened if they don't change their vote. That's what's going on currently as we speak, and it's all a direct result of our U.S. Constitution as it was written, addressing and creating the Electoral College. That's the relevancy it has today. In all other presidential elections, they're not just some meaningless words written into our national Constitution. They have life.
I have to ask the question, if there's 20 votes for Pennsylvania, and 2 people would change their minds to do something different than what was happening in the state level, what have to be 18 and 2 then?
It could be 18 and 2.
Not the majority or anything?
That's correct. Now, when I said what the law says, what the U.S. Constitution says, it's metered. It's all set by date, just as any other election is. One attorney said to me several years back, he's an experienced attorney, let me put it that way, stopped me in a hallway up in the county building. He says, you know, Larry, I don't know how you guys keep this all together. He said, you're just held specifically to certain dates where you have to have certain things done. It's not like any other administrative offices where you could say, okay, let's wait till next week. Let's wait till tomorrow. We don't have that luxury. It is the same thing with the Electoral College and your presidential electors. The law says they will caucus in each state capital. For us in Pennsylvania, it's high noon. Those electors will meet in Harrisburg under the supervision of the chief state election official to vote by secret ballot for their presidential candidate and vice presidential candidate.
For the election, I heard them say, for example, Pennsylvania is a winner-take-all state.
Yes, sir.
There are some states where they divide the electoral vote by the populace.
They're apportioned, Maine and Nebraska.
That's
They're apportioned, right. Maine and Nebraska.
Who determines the political makeup of these 20 electors? Who determines the political makeup of these 20 electors in Pennsylvania? How can you keep them all from being Republican or Democrat?
You can't, because it's the slate of electors chosen by the presidential nominees, their party functionaries, immediately after the conventions. They all get together. They form their own slates. And I'll talk about an election where there were several states in the Union where that occurred, where you had a double slate of electors presented to Congress, and what that resulted in. So not all your presidential elections, sometimes as we like to think or get all excited about, when it seems to be chaos, what's going on here, just like pieces of a puzzle that fit neatly together. A lot of your presidentials weren't that way at all. Not just in our time, as we saw in 2000.
Can I add to that? In the case of Pennsylvania, did a Clinton and a Trump representative then each nominate 10 of the 20, or?
No, they're not nominated, they're chosen. They're chosen as electors for that party and for that candidate. Each candidate in each party will select its own slate of electors. Depending upon what party, what candidates get the popular vote in the state. In this instance, it was Donald Trump. So it'll be Donald Trump's electors who are going to caucus. But, you're welcome, sir, but they're not absolutely legally bound by law, even though we have state laws in a lot of instances. You know, these people, sometimes they take pledges, you know, to not change their mind. They're committed to one candidate or the other. It's they that they're expected to vote for. But that's not totally true.
I just have a question. Is the caucus closed to the public? Or is it open to the public?
The electors,
Yes.
that's closed to the public. Yeah, they'll cast their ballots. They'll cast a secret ballot, just like we do when we go to vote at any other election. Those ballots are sealed. That'll happen on December the 19th in all 50 states and the District of Columbia, our national capital. Why? It's not a state, is it?
Larry, question for you. If they're sealed ballots and someone voted different than what they're supposed to, how would you know who did it? Or do they go back and go over and make that person?
No, what happens is after those ballots are cast at the state level, then there's a date by which those ballots must be delivered to whom? The President of the Senate. No later than 9 days after the state caucuses. Now, who's the President of the Senate? The Vice President. So those ballots must be delivered to the Vice President as President of the Senate in preparation for a joint session of Congress. The House and the Senate members will sit together in chamber. Those ballots will be opened and counted. That'll occur on January the 6th to see whether or not the constitutional requirements are met. One, that a candidate receives a majority vote, at least. In this instance, this presidential, it'll be 270, right? We have 435 representatives in Congress, 100 senators, for a total of 535. Where did the other 3 electors come from? D.C. And that wasn't changed until 1961, just as recently as 1961, by an amendment to our Constitution, Amendment 23. You had other major amendments. Amendment 14, right after the Civil War, where anybody who was involved in insurrection against America, against the United States, could not serve as an elector. That was a direct result of the Civil War. And the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment, which basically changed the process by which the President and Vice President were selected. And let me tell you why, and I think you'll find this very interesting. In the basic Constitution, if you were to read it, it says under Article 2, Section 2, the electors would vote for 2 persons. And I'm going to underscore that word person, because it was very significant. When we came to an election involving Thomas Jefferson and Allen Burr in 1800. Allen Burr and Thomas Jefferson were of the same party. They were running mates. But Article 2, Section 2 says they vote for 2 persons. The person getting the higher number of votes is elected president, the lesser number of votes vice president. But what happened? They both tied. So what then? You have a tie of electoral votes. Who's going to be the president and vice president? What's the mechanism for deciding how that tie is going to be determined? It goes to the House of Representatives. So your representatives in the House become electors themselves. And it's happened where your members of the House of Representatives have become the electors who chose a president. The Constitution goes on further to state that only 1 vote per congressional delegation will cast a ballot for the president and vice president. So if we have currently 20 reps, meeting senators also, if that were to happen in our time, Pennsylvania would only get 1 vote, along with the other 49 states, in the House of Representatives. And what if they don't gain majority after the presidential electors' votes are counted? What if nobody has a majority as the Constitution requires? It goes to the House of Representatives for determination. But I'm going to I'll give you a list of presidential elections where this has happened. In one specifically in 1876, which had far-ranging implications for this nation, where you had a presidential candidate who initially had the majority of electoral votes, had won also the popular vote, but his opponent was elected president. How did that happen? It seems contrary to the Constitution, doesn't it? But it occurred, and when I said it had far-ranging implications for this nation, and I'm going to tell you how. If there's no vice president selected, if there's a tie vote there, as a result of the 12th Amendment to try to correct what Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson had to face in the presidential of 1800. So Congress say, no more of this has to be corrected. Ergo, we have the 12th Amendment, where they'll vote on separate ballots for president and vice president. No more voting for 2 persons, as the original requirement in the Constitution says. So let me turn this election of 1876 and why it's so important. You had a Democratic governor from New York, Governor Tilden. You had a Republican governor from the state of Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes. Tilden had beaten Hayes both in the Electoral College. He had 184 votes to Hayes's 165. Plus, Governor Tilden, who was a famous governor at the time, just give you a little aside here, he was the governor and an attorney who broke up Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall, some of you are shaking your heads, yes, a powerful New York political organization. And Governor Tilden had a lot to do with breaking that group up. So you see some of the political activities we see today happen back then. They said, if you ever want to read about one of the worst presidential, dirtiest presidential elections you'd ever want to read about. Read about the election in 1824. It might put us to shame today. So it's happened. But anyways, what was going on at that time in the 1870s? And it played a significant role in how the deal was made in Congress to select Hayes, the Republican, over Governor Tilden, who had carried both votes, Electoral College and popular. What happened? Reconstruction. The reconstruction of the southern states. You had Florida, you had Louisiana, you had South Carolina, still occupied by federal troops. They wanted those federal troops out of there. They wanted them out of there for a reason, which I'll discuss with you. So they had two sets of electors. The Democrat candidate had one set of electors, the Republicans another, coming out of Louisiana, Florida, South Carolina. So who were they going to seat in Congress? Whose votes were going to be counted? So what happened? What backroom deals, what party deals, like we see today, were made to provide those votes, one of which, among the 20, was an elector from the state of Oregon, by the way. The Southern Democrats, the Solid South as we knew it, and this is how the Solid South happened, went to Governor Hayes' group and said, look, we'll deliver these Republican votes out of those contested states. There was a special commission formed. That's what it was called, I guess, to make it sound good or seem good. A special commission formed in Congress, including, I think, one Supreme Court justice, who were to try to decide how this could be settled. So these Southern Democrats, who became known as the Democrat Redeemers, as far as the South was concerned, said, look, we'll deliver these votes, Hayes, but we want you to promise us some things. Number one, we want those federal troops out of the South. Two, we want a transcontinental railroad built across the South. Three, we want support from the federal government to industrialize the South. And to, by the way, appoint a Democrat to his cabinet. And we see what's going on with Donald Trump right now, right, trying to select the folks to occupy his cabinet positions. While the Democrats in the South said at that time, you promise us a Democrat to fill one of your cabinet positions. And a Democrat was appointed as Postmaster General. Okay? Once those federal troops were moved out of the South, as Hayes promised, now keep in mind, with those 20 electoral votes, Hayes won the presidency by one vote, 184 to 185. And there was a uproarious effort, an outroar among certain Democratic organizations in the states at that time about the dirty deals that were made. Now, did you hear what I said? Governor Hayes did not win the popular election. Governor Hayes did not win the electoral election, but he was elected the president by one vote because of the deal that was made as to what electors were going to be counted. So you think everything is squaring up? And this is a presidential election. But it's a matter of practicality. Let's get it settled. This is how we're going to settle it. So as a result, what happened? What happened with the southern states? The states' rights now, they all stood up as they were screaming before the Civil War. Federal government, what you're trying to make us do, violates our state's rights. And there's a clause in the Constitution which addresses states' rights. Okay, not all powers assigned in the federal government by the Constitution, nor denied by it to the states, those powers belong to the states. And we hear it today. So what followed? What evolved? It had, most of us, as I can see in this room, affected us, affected me in a way when I was in high school. The Jim Crow laws legalized segregation. Legalized now, built into the code of laws, because the states now were exercising in the South states' rights. What also happened? The Negroes, as they were called at that time, were denied the right to vote. You remember the Freedom Riders and all the upheaval in the 60s. What occurred then was a direct result of that compromise of 1877 at the presidential election. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act in the mid-60s, in President Johnson's administration, was a throwback against discrimination, segregation, Jim Crow laws that all evolved out of that compromise of 1877, almost 100 years before. That's what happened. The effect of the Electoral College, the electors, and how that compromise was settled, how it was determined. Okay, electors from Florida, South Carolina, Louisiana will deliver our votes. Now, Tilden, I don't know what happened to him as a Democrat, why they didn't approach him. Maybe he didn't want to make any deals. Hayes's people did. We'll promise you A, B, C, D, and E if you deliver those electoral votes to us. And that's how Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president out of the presidential election of 1876. Anybody have any questions? Yes, sir. Sir, I couldn't tell you. I don't know. I don't know what the question was. I assume being the president, addressing the president, who wrote the first executive order? I do know that presidents have written a number of them. Who wrote the first one? I couldn't tell you. I don't know. But what elections were similar to what happened in 1876? Not as raw, let's say, maybe as far-reaching, 1824, Andy Jackson and John Quincy Adams. Arthur Harrison, James Harrison in 1888. So there have been about 4 or 5 elections, presidential elections, where the House of Representatives had to play the role it was assigned by the U.S. Constitution. Now, what happens with the vice president? If the vice president isn't selected, if that second person doesn't get majority vote, a greater number of votes, it goes to the U.S. Senate, where each senator has the right to cast a ballot. And also under those circumstances, I don't want to get this muddied up, but there has to be a quorum of 2/3 of the members plus majority vote. So that's how the U.S. Constitution is written. The amendments, the 12th, the 14th, the 23rd, all affect the Electoral College. So we'll see now what happens on December the 19th all the electors of caucus in all 50 states. It's in Pennsylvania. It'll be at high noon to cast their ballots for the president and vice president. Now, you see the difference between the organization today, what it was back then. When we go through our nominating processes, both major political parties, and I guess some of the minor parties now, and they'll nominate a presidential candidate. That presidential candidate selects his own running mate, and they'll appear on a ticket. Now, as I said at the beginning of the discussion, and the reason I provided you with these ballots is to look at the language and look at what's not there and how all that ties in to the Electoral College and our U.S. Constitution. In Pennsylvania, at the primaries and presidential years, we have a straw poll. It's just the way they look at the sentiment of the voting public as to which candidates that public sort of gravitates towards. But the real nuts and bolts occurs at the general election. And the language at the top of that ballot where it says presidential electors.
A question back in the back of Margaret.
Mr. Spahr, could you give us a sample or an example of some of the misinformation that we're hearing from a major network?
Yeah, I guess it's even on the internet, I guess on Facebook. There's all kind of, I'll say quote unquote garbage that's being disseminated. I mean, it's just like the Wild West, if the Wild West were even like this. I mean, where they're hammering away at these presidential electors, not by hundreds, by thousands of emails, as I understand it, and even to the point where they're threatening these people if they don't change their votes. And in some instances, as to how, where the Electoral College is concerned, and these folks, from one side, are saying they're duty bound to vote for the pledge candidates, the pledges to the candidates, which is not absolutely true. These people have the right to change their mind, and that issue, as I said, has never been contested in the U.S. Supreme Court to this very day. They're called faithless electors.
Larry, let me just, when you talk about misinformation, what I've seen, depending on which station you listen to, you'll get two different views. I also think what I see a lot, and I'm just doing my observation, please, that's just my thoughts, that I see people take one sentence out of a whole context, or they take something out here, they take what they want to take out, depending on what they're trying to prove to. And I think the media has done so much to influence elections these days. I think we all agree with that. I mean, I don't know, and I listen to the station, my wife said I drive her nuts because I'm watching up to the election. I was interested, being part of the process at that level. And by the way, thank you, but I am Harlan-Schober County Commissioner. I didn't know that, I guess that's who I am. Just thank you for reminding me. So, but there's so much information comes out there. You also have to sit back, and I think, if it's someone texts you something, if it's on Facebook, it doesn't mean it's always true. So I think people just gravitate, it's news, they're trying to make news, and so I guess we have to all make our own minds up, but I would say when you listen to a station, you listen to what's said, there's gonna be another story just like it on the other side, and so you gotta sit back, and I think what this has shown me tonight, by the way, is I didn't know a lot of this, by the way, because I guess I'm not a history buff. But it says that things that maybe history, knowing history, helps us make better choices in the future. And I think what you've opened up is a lot of information tonight, Larry, and I appreciate you coming out and doing that for the people. But before we close off, any other questions that you have, let's get your questions, because I know we went through a lot.
Yeah, I have one more question. Do I understand that this isn't necessarily about the Electoral College, but do I understand in the earliest elections, whoever got the most votes was president, and whoever got the next amount of votes was the vice president.
The Electoral College.
When did that change?
That changed with the 12th Amendment. That changed with the 12th Amendment as a direct result of what happened in the Thomas Jefferson Aaron Burr election of 1800s.
You have a president from one party and a vice president from another.
Well, I tell you, that's a very interesting question. Very interesting. It all depends how these electors cast their ballots. You know, it's just like a write-in vote. You know, the electors don't have to choose anybody's names on the ballot. As I said, that would make an interesting case for the U.S. Supreme Court, which has never contested to this day any such arrangement, or where you have the faithless electors maybe breaking state law, where the states have laws. And look, you know, you got to vote for the candidates to whom you were pledged. And those candidates are selected, select you people based on popular vote in our state. Some states have laws of that nature, but who knows?
What do you think the chances are of having a major surprise on December the 19th?
Almost nil. Almost nil. Historically, you had some electors change their mind, but they were an absolute minority. Historically, it's the other way around. Most of your electors will vote for the candidates to whom they pledged. That's been the historical record.
Question back here?
Yeah, if these electors are getting physically threatened, is there any way that they can become anonymous? Is there any way to keep their identities?
You know, that's another interesting question you just asked, and I'll tell you why. In Pennsylvania, the Secretary of the Commonwealth, who's the chief election officer, was taking a lot of heat because he released the names, the addresses of the presidential electors. Whether or not that was legal, I don't know. I imagine it wasn't illegal because a few years back, another presidential election, I accessed the names of electors of a certain party. I saw who was chosen in Pennsylvania. But the Secretary of the Commonwealth said, look, this is public information. We can't hold back. But for safety reasons, security reasons, he was taking a lot of heat for releasing that information.
The media outlets, mainly TV, we watched night after night after night them telling us who's going to win this, what states are going to do this. How did they know how many Hispanics voted, how many blacks voted? I don't understand from just voting how they would know this so quickly and rejected 44% of Hispanics voted for Trump. How did they know this?
Well, a lot of them, if you listen to them, they place a lot of faith on these so-called exit polls. Well, they'll interview a certain number of voters coming out and all that. Then if they want to volunteer the information, you know, it's up to the voter. You know, I've had questions on election day where some of these news media type go outside polls and, you know, they approach voters and to put it bluntly, I told them, I said, you want to tell them go to hell? You tell them go to hell. That's your own business. I said, you can answer if you want. It's up to you. You don't have to respond. But it was very interesting to watch these pollsters, these political pundits.
Larry, use your mic, please.
Oh,
These political pundits and these pollsters, and we hear today how they got it all wrong. Got it all wrong. And I don't care who was elected. That's up to the people of this country. But, to my personal opinion, these mainstream media types, I'll call them, see, 20 years ago, I read a book. I went down to the University of Pittsburgh after somebody had loaned me a copy. It was written by, I think, Kenneth Grider. Who Will Tell the People? That was the title of his book. That was the last edition they had at the bookstore at the University of Pittsburgh. I went down on a Saturday afternoon. He discussed 20 years ago in his book what we're seeing today. How the information and through whom that information's all filtered. That's why Thomas Jefferson was a strong proponent of public education. So you must have an educated electorate if we're going to survive as a democracy.
Larry, here's a question back here.
I appreciate you clearing up that some states do have laws that
Yes, sir, that's
require-
correct.
Okay. Pennsylvania does not,
Pennsylvania does.
but you pledge. You take a pledge okay. So in essence, these electors are ethically bound. And basically, that's why they're thought of as scoundrels from that previous election if they don't follow what they're ethically bound to do.
That's correct. It's interesting to note, as I said earlier, one of the efforts, one of the goals through the Electoral College that was being attempted to elect a person of virtue and a person of ability. Now, do some of these electors have virtue?
Question here?
My question is not about the Electoral College, but about our system as a whole. Many years ago, the candidates made their whistle-stop speeches because they were traveling by train across the country to reach the people. Now, with our modern communication and transportation, when we know everything that they're saying right away, what's the possibility of ever having one national primary?
That's been discussed. But the problem is, certain laws would have to change, including what's written in that Constitution, where basically elections are an animal of the state. They are a creature of the state. So that, the Constitution, number one, would have to be amended. And I don't know how many states would relinquish that power, that authority.
You can clarify for me, you said that at the state level, they have the secret ballots. Those secret ballots are delivered to the vice president. It's opened up in front of the open House and Senate.
Joint session of Congress.
How would you know one person did not vote accordingly?
You wouldn't.
So nobody knows who might, of all the people.
That's right. Unless they make a declaration, it's a secret ballot. And those, as I said, ballots are up this year. It'll be January the 6th. They'll be opened before a joint session of Congress under, again, the supervision of the President of the Senate, who is the Vice President, and those votes will be tallied.
I just have to make 2 points. The first point is, it seems like, after reading as much as I have, I worked in the high school, I've heard history teachers talking about all this for many, many years. I think we get to the point where we need to do away with Electoral College. It was set up way back when people were ill-informed, there was not a means of communication. People are much more informed now. And then we wouldn't have all this backroom deal stuff. I mean, I think that's what disgusts most of us, is if my vote really counts, it really doesn't. So why are we even bothered going through a general election if it's the Electoral College that is deciding who our president is? And we are the only democracy in this whole world that in a democracy this happens. The only one. And we're supposed to be the leaders of the free world. That's my only comment.
Well, I can respond to that, and, I mean, that's your opinion, but I'll speak to you factually. If each one of you would have the opportunity to sit in that elections office during the time the election is being set up, an election is conducted, and the election is what I like to call being consolidated, if you would hear some of the comments that are made, you wonder if these people know they're on planet Earth. And I'm not joking, not one bit. So it's from that standpoint, I think the founding fathers understood that and thought that that position of president was much too vital to totally leave it to the general public's opinion. They play a role, as I said, it plays a role. But I don't know, some of these people, you guys probably see in the paper, they don't come out and vote. We had a record turnout, about 103,000 people here in Washington County for a presidential since I've been up there. You won't see 3/4 of these people again until the next presidential. But yet you'll have school directors on the ballot who have almost unlimited taxing power. The people need to be, and I'll tell you what, we talk about education. Let me talk about that for a second. And I'm a strong proponent and maybe a critic. These kids are not taught enough, given a curriculum, at least in junior high where I was exposed to it. There were things that I learned in college that I wasn't aware of, thanks to some professors. These states need to require a curriculum, at least maybe back to high school, to teach these kids about their own electoral and governmental process. A lot of these kids are totally ignorant.
I had another question about when the Electoral College was originally set up. Wasn't part of the reason was that the smaller states felt that the more populous states would control the elections, which would have happened in this election, and thus the votes of all the states that went for Donald Trump, which were most, those votes really wouldn't have counted because the 3 or 4 populous areas would have controlled the popular vote. So wasn't that the reason it was set up in the first place? Was that the smaller states were going to refuse to join the union because they would be left out, in essence, of the voting process?
That's exactly right. That's exactly where popular vote's concerned. Again, the founding fathers and J. Madison Hamilton argued in the Federalist Papers. They had to find a way to equal out that power. You know, if the folks wanted to take advantage of it, so that your more populous states wouldn't dominate presidential elections.
I had one other comment that I had heard, the difference between a democracy and a republic. We are a republic. I mean, we have a democracy, but can you explain that a little bit more? Because the republic is...
What our official form of government is, you're right, is a representative democracy. And the people have a right to choose their representatives who will function in government under certain authorities, such as their constitutions, both state and federal, will provide to them. And the whole thrust of these constitutions, and I'm sure some of you have heard, have been exposed to it, was to limit government power. Not to have far-ranging powers that reach into people's private lives. That's not the purpose. It wasn't the purpose of these constitutions. It was to limit the power of government, to give government power where it was critical, such as General Eisenhower. One of the best definitions of government I ever read was one made by General Eisenhower. To do for the people what they can't do for themselves, nor do as well, except in a collective sense. And I know in between, there's a lot of issues that arise. You're having your fight with the Supreme Court nominees now, or a nominee. It may be future nominees, in how they interpret language, and which way their opinions will flow. You know, we're fortunate in a way. Maybe we are disciplined enough as a society and a nation to accept these opinions and move on and try to correct them at the ballot box. rather than, as people like to say, in the banana republics, you end up in a shooting revolution. I hope that, we're astute enough.
Tell you what, I see two hands just went up. So let's take these two last questions, and then if you have something else that's really burning, I'm sure Larry will answer the question and we'll have everybody decide if you want to stick around. Is fair enough? Pardon me, Larry.
That's all right.
I had the opportunity to speak to someone who became a citizen. And at that time, when he did, he was told he had to vote Democratic. Do you know anything about that?
No, ma'am, I don't. We have sometimes up in the elections office, we get accused of saying, oh, I went to register Democrat. Let me tell you, I handled a lady's problem who had moved here from Upper St. Clair over to the county. She went to vote at the poll, and somehow, during the transfer of her record, she was listed as a Democrat. And in fact, there was a lady who moved here to Peters Township. And I spoke with her, and I said, ma'am, and I said, let me see if I can help you. Well, I went to Allegheny County, I looked at her back record, the judge of elections come on the phone, and I told him, I said, I won't mention his name, I said, this lady's been voting consistently over in Allegheny County as a Republican. I said, somehow, which happens? Somehow that data, that information gets messed up. And I said, let her go ahead and vote her Republican ballot. And I said, we'll officially change the record up here after the election. But those things happen.
I think there are mistakes that are made. And I get calls, through all this process, a lot of things, and someone said, I know I registered Democrat, but I know I registered Democrat, but I have a Republican, and I'm on the Republican ballot, and so you have these things, but when someone calls you look at it, and they find out that there's something there, they take care of it right away, so.
I know, because I work.
Okay, well, then you know what we're
But
talking
what
about.
I'm saying is, this man didn't want to vote Democrat, but he didn't know
Yeah, he wasn't educated at that point.
Right.
Was this in a primary or a general election?
I don't know.
That'd be the primary.
Must have been, and,
Where, yeah, they have one of the other
we had
ballots.
a casual conversation, and back then there was a lot of talk about Trump and Hillary and so on. And
If you know who this guy is, he still has a problem, you make sure he calls me. We'll take care of it.
You talk about,
Honestly, those things can happen, I know that.
you talk about the liberties. About 20-some years ago, we had a young Russian brought by State Department officials up to the county to watch our tabulation of votes in our election process. In fact, he gave me a pin, which I still have. He was from Kiev. He was a member of the Supreme Soviet at that time. And through an interpreter, a young lady who spoke excellent Russian, was conversing with me. One of the things he said to me, and I heard this same thing when I was in San Francisco one year from an immigrant from Red China. This young Russian said to me, Larry, he said, you people do not appreciate the liberties that you have. And that Chinese fella in Chinatown, who was a teacher, by the way, in Red China, said almost the same thing to me. He said, you don't know what it's like to live under a government where you have informants who might be members of your own family, and then you have government people come knocking on your door in the middle of the night for you being disloyal to your government. He said, that's what happens. We take, in my opinion, too much for granted in this country, and someday we may pay for it.
Larry, over here.
I just wanted to go back to one thing that was said about the Electoral College being set up so that the larger states couldn't take advantage. The issue is now, if you're in a smaller state, a less popular state, such as Wyoming, your vote counts for much, much more than if you live in a state such as California. If you live in California and you're a Republican, you might as well not even go and vote. And as far as the candidates going to larger states, that isn't true. Well, first of all, in this day and age with the TV and the internet, we all can watch them and know what's going on. They don't go to the larger states. They don't go to the smaller states. They go to the swing states. That's all they go to anymore.
well, they're looking at that electoral vote. But, you know, again, I heard the other day, I was talking to an individual, mentioned California. He said, why go there? It's so predominantly Democratic. Why waste your time?
That's what I mean.
You know, that
They
was
don't go
discussed.
there, and
Sure.
it's predominantly Democratic, and so, like I said, if you're a Republican,
Well, I tell you, as I said, I don't care who the people chose. You know, it's up to the people in this country.
it's
Don't-
not.
Yeah, but hey, here, wait a minute now, hear me out. Maybe there was a wake-up call in this election when you had certain groups who were taken for granted, maybe because their voices weren't raised in past elections, but they sure as hell were raised in this one.
Okay, I think we're about done this evening. All right, thank you, Larry Spahr. And if you have any questions, Larry, you'll be here for a few minutes. If you have a question you want to ask him, please do so. Thank you, everybody, for coming out.